Today I want to talk about a simple yet important element in narrative structure known as planting and payoff. The most basic way to think of planting and payoff is the idea of Chekhov's gun. In an 1889 letter, Chekhov wrote one must never place a loaded rifle on the stage if it isn't going to go off. Chekhov believed that all narrative elements in a story should be both necessary and irreplaceable. Well, I've only got four for big boy here, so he's all but useless. Not all movies adhere to this principle. Some just meander around and do whatever, but good ones do. You've got two left. And I know that a lot of this is a matter of taste, but in a broader sense audience satisfaction derives in part from the way that narrative elements are introduced and paid off. Some plantings are obvious with an inferred. This is going to pay off later, basically emblazoned into the ski, and others are more subtle. But for a full satisfying narrative, generally when an element is introduced, be it plot-driven, thematic, or physical, it should pay off in some way and also tee into all the other narrative elements. Whenever people correctly use the term deus ex machina, it is so much because the salvation element is convenient, but because it had not been planted or set up. You don't call Max's method for saving Furiosa at the end of Mad Max Fury Road a deus ex machina because the means are so thoroughly planted throughout the narrative, especially in the first act of the film, so that when the Vulvolini says, the audience immediately knows what the solution is because Max's universal donor blood has been repeatedly established. The importance of how narrative information is planted and paid off is best demonstrated when it is done poorly or not at all. Just because an element is planted doesn't mean the payoff, to put it diplomatically, is necessarily narratively satisfying. Narrative elements can be introduced in a manner of ways. Dialogue is a common one, but this is film. It is never as simple as just a line of dialogue introducing an element. The framing, the color, the camera movement, the sound design, all of these elements imbue meaning. So pacing matters, but so too does order. To pick on Zack Snyder, again, because he is really bad at this particular thing, the order in which you place your narrative elements matters. For example, the idea that Clark should hide his alien self in Man of Steel. The problem with introducing this conflict is that tension of will he or want to use his powers to help people has already been resolved. It's resolved in the very first scene we see adult Clark. So we have the planting after the payoff. The answer is given before the question. The Universe films, Man of especially, really weigh too heavily on what the audience already knows about Superman from their basic experiences of living in the world, rather than setting up its own internal narrative about this character. The trick with narrative is to plant elements early and eventually pay them off in a way that doesn't feel obvious or contrived. It needs to make sense and it needs to feel organic. Information can be imparted through dialogue, but I'm more interested in visual and sound information, so I wanted to do a brief overview of three non-dialogue elements from Mad Max Fury Road: the silver spray, Max's blood, and Max's boot. Your basic narrative planting and payoff will include a setup, a reminder, and the payoff. Though depending on how closely together within the narrative the planting and the payoff occurs, we may not need a reminder. Let's look at the war boy spray. This nameless character is fatally wounded. The sound drops out. The film slows down. All of the characters pay attention to this guy, and it draws audience attention to the fact that this is important information and you need to pay attention. First we get the visual element, the spray, followed by a dialogue element, and then this. Information acquired. Silver-mouthed spray signifies that a pseudo-religious suicide mission is about to take place, the witness call and response imparting that to these goes, this is the most baddest thing ever, and also communal. They are judged on their performance. See, these guys are impressed. Slit, not so much. So the payoff for this comes not far down the road. Nux is the only war boy left who can stop Furiosa after she runs this vehicle into the hurricane. This further spurs him on. He wants to be like these guys. So without having to say anything so on the nose as it's suicide bomb time, when Nux starts doing this, we, like Max, immediately intuit his intentions. So what I find remarkable about the way this culture is explained to the audience, despite this world and culture being so removed and alien from our own, is that we don't really need some fish out of water character having the details of the universe being explained to them. In fact, all you see around you has been taken from the lessons garnered from the historical documents. Is this a spaceship? The audience gets a lot of information about this culture, the universe, and how it works, but it's seen only through the eyes of people who already live in it. They all know what the spray means. A clear planting of a narrative element, followed by the payoff a few minutes later. But with the boot, a bit more time passes between planting and payoff, therefore with this one we need a reminder. An important but subtle theme in Mad Max Fury Road is that of forgiveness when and if circumstance allows. And it is most explicitly shown through the relationship of Max and Nux. Nux unquestioningly objectifies Max, using him as an ornament and violating his body autonomy by stealing his blood. This is not done out of malice, but simply because it does occur to Nux that this might be wrong. This shot is a turning point when they first look at each other, and this is also the beginning of Nux's character arc. For 1/2 of a second he sees Max as human. Then the setup thematically in the form of the boot, which brings us to narrative element / metaphor number whatever. Slit gets kicked off the car by Max. Slit steals Max's boot. The setup: when Max finds Nux unconscious after they wreck the car, Max steals Nux's boot. The reminder. And then the payoff comes far later. Nux is learning to build empathy, has decided to switch sides. The payoff. Max steals a boot from the bullet farmers, a gang, gifts it to Nux. A practical element. Now Nux has 2 shoes again, that's nice. But also thematic. It shows that Max forgives Nux, and on a deeper level that completion points towards Nux finding his own sense of completion by joining Furiosa's ragtag band. A practical thread in the form of a prop, sure, but like everything in this movie, it has a deeper level than that. In this case, one of forgiveness. Max and Nux barely speak a word to each other throughout the entire film, but in this simple gesture we get all that we need to know. Max and Nux would have no concrete connection except for that boot. Besides the boot, the only thing they have is Max's blood. And Max's blood is a huge plot point, so I am not going to go into all of the ways it is set up and paid off. It establishes not only that this is effectively a culture comprised of mostly the sick and the dying, but that Max is a universal donor. A setup that pays off in every big way at the end of the movie, when Max gives Furiosa a direct blood transfusion. The blood tube is important here. First the setup, the reminder, and finally the payoff. But there's another setup that's one of my favorites in the film, because it's like a sub-setup. And it uses not only visuals to get across the information, and not only sound editing, but sound mixing as well. Let's break that down. We're going to talk a little bit about sound mixing. Max rises from the earth like lava from a volcano, and first we get that heartbeat sound. Normally that's a pretty big clicky in sound design, and they tell you to avoid that, like on your first day as a film student. But since here it's literally his own heartbeat he's hearing, we'll give it a pass. But it isn't just that. Max's Disorientation is intercut with shots of lava erupting and corresponding sound effects that come with it. These sounds are mixed using a low-pass filter, a type of audioic filter that cuts off higher frequency sounds. The easy way to remember it is that low frequencies pass on through, therefore it's a low pass, and high frequencies are cut out. Cutting off these frequencies gives almost the sensation of being underwater. Lower frequency sounds are more tenacious at traveling through liquids and solids. This is why bassy noises travel through walls better than piano music. Any sounds that are coming from inside rather than outside are going to have their higher frequencies cut off more, just by virtue of where the sound is coming from and the mediums it has to move through. So Mac's pain and disorientation in this scene is shown by the higher frequency sounds in the scene being cut out. And the tension is relieved when we reintroduce higher frequencies back into the soundscape. The hiss of air escaping and the air tone of the atmosphere. See a focus on the sound here because the framing doesn't really get across the element that is being set up. That of an air bubble in Mac's body and the pain it's causing him. If you watch this scene with the sound off, you can't really tell what's going on. It just kind of looks like the needle was annoying him. But with the sound on, oh, removing the needle releases the air bubble. This may not seem like planted information, but it pays off at the very end, both with the needle and with the air accumulation in the body. It's almost like the guy who wrote this was a former doctor or something. Max doesn't to explain what he's doing. We already know what he's doing because the filmmakers trust the audience enough to intuit what's going on without having to have it explained to them. The information has been planted and now it's time to pay it off. The great thing about this movie is that you could go on 4 hours about all the ways it uses its medium to maximize its potential. Because ultimately, that's what this is all about. How to best tell a story using your given medium. Mad Max Fury Road isn't perfect, but it's about as close to perfect as a movie made by humans is going to get. I mean, I could go on. Hell, I could go on about the sound design alone for another hour. But that's enough for now. Thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe, witness.